Right. Why don't we get started today? Unfortunately, we don't have Victor supporting, so this is going to be a solo show. So, welcome to Maximus Call Radio. And we had a bunch of users submit questions before the show, and I look forward to answering them. If you obviously want to ask any questions live, feel free to chime in, whether you're joining us on Discord, YouTube Live, we have Instagram Live, and we have Clubhouse all simultaneously streaming. So feel free to chime in if you have any live questions. And if not, I will get to the user submitted ones. I can't tell if Ben is speaking or not, but let me double check my audio. Oh, I think we're good to go. All right, why don't we go with the user submitted questions? If he signs back on, we can answer those in turn. I'm just going to pull up one last video source before we go. All right, let's get started with the Caller Radio show. I got Zencaster recording as well, so we can keep this for posterity. So we had a user submitted question. I'm going to read it, and then I will answer it. This is a long one, but I've been trying to get more relationship-oriented questions. So the user DM'd me on Twitter and said, "Hi, Dr. Cam. I feel like I'm at a bit of a crossroads in my relationship with my girlfriend. We've been dating for almost 2 years now. We've had some issues that we been able to resolve. One fundamental thing that bothers me with her personality, people don't change, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. But I haven't what she really means by it. It just comes up sometimes when she disagrees with me on something and feels that people don't change warrants no further discussion. Granted, I get stumped and don't push further on this. In addition, one of the issues I've had with our relationship is she doesn't show much affection as I'd like. And this may be because she's Japanese and they don't show affection in the same way as we do here in the West, Sweden. I'm hesitant to show affection towards her as well because she always rejects me, although she rejects me in a joking way. But as I explained to her, it doesn't feel like a joke if the response you get is 100% of the time. She's I enjoy spending time with her, but I'm not sure if I love her. Love seems very abstract to me, and I feel that some people romanticize it. Is love feeling something along the lines of butterflies in your stomach, or excitement at the idea of the person, or something along the lines of happiness? Or instead, is it knowing that you'd be able to spend your life with the same person without being unhappy? Or maybe something else entirely? Thanks for your time and your wisdom. This is so I appreciate the lengthy question, but why don't we break it down into parts? So the first part of this person's question is asking about there's a little bit of a conflict here, right? Where he's talking about how she has a claim that people don't change. Sounds like he disagrees with that principle, and they haven't been able to reach some sort of resolution around it because there's no further discussion on her part, and he doesn't really push on his part. So the first question that I have regarding this is why does this matter to you? Why is this important? There's lots of philosophical things that you can debate in a relationship, but does your opinion about people don't change really change how you think about her or the quality of your relationship? One of my life mottos is it's more important to be effective than it is to be right. And so who's right on this issue? I don't know, but I'm not sure it really matters. So that's the first question I have is this sort of an egocentric argument where you have a strong opinion about this and you haven't been able to resolve it and now it's kind of bothering you and you're carrying this around. But really, does it matter for the quality of your relationship? If not, then I would suggest letting it go. Now, if there is something that it pertains to the quality of your relationship, what now? If you're talking about an abstract philosophical idea like do people change in general, I'm not sure that how important that is. But if it comes down to there's a deeper meaning behind this, which is does she believe that she can change, right? And there's some things that you want to change about her, and that's why it actually bothers you. Then that I think it is worth discussing. But what I would suggest is you take it away from the level of the abstract, like do people change when you're really talking about her, and then you need to have that discussion with her. I also want to bring up something in terms of how you're approaching this issue, right? It sounds like there's some broken communication in terms of whether it's on the philosophical level or on the personal level. You mentioned that you haven't sat down and discussed this with her, right? You don't push further, and she doesn't kind of elaborate. So let's just step back and understand what's happening here. You have a disagreement that you haven't sat down and discussed, and yet you're asking a psychologist about what you should do. So the first rule of thumb that I always say with my clients is if it's something that you can bring up with me, why haven't you brought it up with her, right? So there's almost a little bit of a passive aggressive quality to your question, which is we need to explore why you feel like you can't bring this up with her or you haven't already. Is there an avoidance in the sense that if you bring it up with her, are you afraid of the way that she's going to respond, or are you concerned that you might potentially have a fight or a conflict around it? Then, if that's the case, then obviously we need to have a discussion about healthy disagreement and how do you have healthy debate in the context of a relationship. But I'm curious why you're avoiding it in the first place, right? Is it you're predicting something bad will happen that's never happened before? Like if you haven't gotten to a lot of fights and you've never brought up something before, then you're probably overestimating the likelihood that this bad thing is going to happen, and it's really driven by your own anxiety, right? Or if it is driven by, yes, we fight all the time and I don't want to have another fight, well, then it sounds like you need to do a little bit of work on your communication. And in that case, I would actually suggest some couples therapy might be very helpful in terms of improving your relationship style, that you can have healthy discussion and debate. But before we even get there, it sounds like the main issue to me is like one, like you got to figure out whether this issue matters in the first place, that it's worth even having this discussion or debate. And like I said, my heuristic for this is if it's an abstract philosophical conversation, drop it and let it go. It doesn't really matter. If it's pertinent to you personally in terms of your whether you want her to change or she wants you to change, and that's what it's really about, then you have to be proactive in bringing it up. You're the man in this relationship, and you're sitting there and complaining, we haven't resolved this when you haven't taken any steps to resolve it. So, what I would suggest is you got to put on your big boy pants, take some responsibility here, and if it's important enough for you to discuss it, and I'm guessing it is, it's important enough that you asked me about it, then you need to bring this up with her, and figure out where you stand, and hopefully come to some sort of resolution about it. And I hope it's not in the abstract philosophical sense. Number two, let's talk about she doesn't show as much affection as I would like, possibly because it sounds like it's your hypothesis. It's because she's Japanese and they don't show affection in the same way as we do here in the West, which is Sweden. So I'm going to address this on a couple of levels. This I do think is an important issue because this is not some abstract question of like a debate about do people change. It's in the context of a close or romantic relationship, affection is really important, and it sounds like it's particularly important to you, and it sounds like it's also missing to some degree. So there, I think that's a real issue, and I would focus much more on this. By the way, if you're going to pick your battles, you brought up three particular questions. I would definitely focus on the second in terms of a discussion to have with her, in terms of where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of benefit. So, first of all, you're making a cultural attribution, right? You're saying she's Japanese, I'm Swedish, we have different styles. Now, there may be a hint of truth to that in that, yes, Eastern versus Western cultures may have different levels of, uh, affection in terms of how they show that in the context of relationships, particularly publicly. But I would have to say, what the interesting thing is, Swedish people in the Nordic cultures are not actually particularly known as being affectionate either. So, one thing I would actually encourage you to do is maybe discount the cultural aspect, it's not that cultural differences don't exist. They do. But I actually think if I had to predict what is a bigger influence on how affection is, what a bigger influence is on how affectionate someone is in the context of relationship, and I had to pick between their culture, their familial upbringing, and then their individual personality, I would actually put culture dead last, because you can have a Japanese family that brought up their children to be very affectionate, and that's going to trump whatever cultural background they are, because it's a high affection, high empathy family. And then the same thing, your individual personality, like even in Japanese culture, there are introverts, there are extroverts, there's low affection, there's high affection, and there's quite a bit of variability. You'll find that in every single culture, by the way, right? So I don't buy into like the group macro stereotype. There may be small differences on a cultural level in terms of affective expressivity, but I would say it's trumped by a lot more in terms of how her mother and father, and maybe even siblings, showed affection in terms of her primary social learning, and then her individual personality, right? Like there's just people who are high warmth, high affection, high agreeableness is probably the personality trait that's most associated with that. So I think those are two more important things. Now, why am I talking about this? Because I'm almost getting a little too philosophical here, but it is actually important and pertinent, because when you make it a cultural issue primarily, then it's not open to change. Going back to your first thing, but when it's about sort of, well, family, individual differences, then I think you regard them a little bit more as a person. Right now, it doesn't mean you can obviously change overnight someone's family upbringing, or certainly their personality, which is known to be stable over time. But it does mean that it's shaped or formed a little bit more than we give credit for. And as a result of that, that means that it can be worked out to some degree. Now, I'm going to go back to the same bit of advice that I gave about question number one: is have you talked to her about this? Because that's the thing that's missing in your question. I haven't heard you said, I've talked to her about it and she says she can't do it, or it's just not her, or she doesn't feel authentic. All I heard is she doesn't show as much affection as I'd like. Okay, great. And how have you tried to address this? The fact that you haven't mentioned it, I don't know, makes me suspicious that you haven't brought it up. So I think you need to have a conversation with her. Now, the second part, you say, I'm hesitant to show affection towards her because she always rejects me, but she rejects me in a joking way. And now it sounds like you have talked about this a little bit with her, in that it doesn't feel like a joke if that's the response you get 100% of the time. There's something wrong, at least on the description of this dynamic, right? So it sounds like you have almost this learned helplessness that you've developed over time, because when you've tried to show behaviorally affection, it sounds like you're getting rejected. And I'm curious, but this is why I would encourage you to call in. When you say she rejects you in a joking way, what is that about, right? What exactly does that look like? And what do you mean when I try to show affection towards her? Are you expressing that verbally, like in terms of telling her, that you like her? Are you talking about physical affection? She's rejecting you? Because I do think this matters. And what's the context? Is it public? Is it private? Maybe some people don't like public displays of affection, and she's kind of like, trying to blow you off. That I think is a separate issue, and that may be healthy to some reasonable degree, because of privacy concerns, social cultural concerns, etc. But if you're talking about the privacy of your own home, you've dated her for a long time, she's rejecting you in terms of, your emotional or your physical intimacy, then I think that is obviously problematic. So I need a little further explanation in terms of, that. But I think the way that you're approaching it, again, it sounds avoidant. When you say I'm hesitant to show affection, it's like, well, I've been burned once or twice, or maybe many times, and now I'm hesitant to do it anymore. Versus, here's what I would suggest: yes, don't beat your head against the wall. If you've been rejected 10 times, I'm not saying do it again, because it's probably going to end up in the same result. But I do think you need to talk to her about it, but talk to her about it in a different way. When she's like, oh, okay, it's just a joke, and you're like, well, it doesn't feel like a joke, I think you need to circumnavigate a little bit of this issue. It's not about the joke. It's about you're not getting your needs met, right? And you need to express that to her and just say, hey, you know, when I try to show you affection in whatever form it is, I noticed that you reject me. And I don't know if it's sort of serious or not, but in either case, it makes me feel rejected. Talk about how it makes you feel emotionally, and talk about the impact that it has. Where I it makes me concerned that I'm unloved, or is my affection being reciprocated, or am I getting my needs met? Right? You need to be able to express that to her and talk about that, because if it's important to you, and it sounds like it is because you're talking about it with me, you got to address that in some way. Now, hopefully, like I said, talk about it with her and just say, look, this is what I want out of this relationship. This is the type of affection that I want. Is it words of affirmation in terms of your love language? Is it physical touch? Is it acts of service? Is it gifts, to kind of use that framework? But tell her what kind of affection that you like. Figure out on her end, what is she willing and able to do? Does that match up in terms of your love languages, so to speak? And is she flexible and agreeable enough that, even if it's not her tendency, if it's not her predisposition, is she willing to, compromise and go a little, bend a little for you? Because I actually do think that's very uh, understandable as well. You don't need to have the same love languages, right? Guys tend to be a lot more into physical touch, in terms of their love language. And women stereotypically tend to be more, verbally, gift kind of oriented, and that's fine as long as you're both willing to provide each other's love language, right? She's willing to give you a massage, or physical intimacy. You're willing to give her, gifts and praise, and you're happy. Doing that. That's a fair exchange, in my opinion, and that's a reasonable, mature compromise that you've been able to verbally articulate in the context of a relationship. That's what a mature relationship is. And I think there's something missing there, where for some reason, for whatever reason, you're not able to have sort of this kind of mature conversation with her. Now, I'm not blaming it all on you. Maybe it's hard for her to talk about these things, whether that's individually based on her family or based on her culture. But I do think you need to get to that point, because otherwise, again, you're sort of not getting your needs met. So if it's really difficult, like you've tried to do this a few times, you try to have this conversation, I would actually encourage you to do couples therapy, because maybe there's almost some remedial work that needs to be done in terms of, okay, this is how you have a conversation with your partner. And maybe there's some emotional blockers, maybe it's anxiety or shame that's even preventing you or her from having this discussion in the first place. And if it's at that level, there needs to be some social skills or some relationship training, then yes, some couples therapy may be helpful. All right. So now let's address the third point that you brought up, which is, I'm not sure I love her. And also to you, it's like, I don't know what love means. Is it a butterfly in my stomach? Is it excitement at the idea of person? It sounds like you've clearly never been in love, which is a okay. And I have okay, I'm gonna give my sort of personal opinion about this. I'm sure some other people may have a different point of view. I don't think there's a lot of established science around this. So this is one area where, the magic of the feelings of love, it's going to be a little bit more subjective in terms of my response to this. Um, I think people weight the value and the importance of love, in the context of relationship. I will have to say, historically speaking, the googly kind of feelings of love, were not as important, as they are today, right? I think back in the day, a little, if you're talking about sort of traditional relationships and marriage, it was really, and there's a reason. There's sort of like it's a religious, and governmental contract. It's a little bit of it's a commitment, an oath, and or a duty, in which you decide to like share a life and finances, and family together. And so, in doing so, now you hope that either there's pre-existing, romantic inclination, or in the context of, let's say, an arranged marriage, that develops, over time. It may not, or at least there's a deep, profound respect and admiration that hopefully develops. But there may or they may not be love, and I don't think it was at least weighted as important as it is today. I do think there is a little bit of a Disney slash Hollywood, revitalization, and maybe that's also because with the increasing emancipation of women, They don't need to be as financially reliant, and so they can pursue a little bit more of a emotional agenda versus a very practical approach to marriage, which may not be a bad thing at all. But as it pertains to men, this is a different sort of question, right? Which is like, how important is it for you when you're deciding, okay, is this the love of my life, and I want to like pursue a long term relationship and marry her? It's for you to have those feelings. Here's what I would say. I think it's important to explore why you're not having those feelings. Right now, I don't know how old you are. You seem kind of young to me. I don't know how many relationships you've had. If this is your only relationship, then you may not have a lot of context. Maybe she's not the one, and she's not eliciting that for you. Versus if you've been in like, I don't know, 5 relationships, and let's say you felt that about someone else and you haven't felt it about her, then it's maybe something about your current relationship. Now, if you told me I've been in 5, maybe even 10 relationships, I've never felt that way about anyone, I would say, well, it's either a personal problem with you, or maybe you're just not that type of person. I definitely think there's a lot of men who don't get head over heels in love with someone, like the Hollywood storybook kind of romance. And they literally do think sometimes there's something wrong. Right now, there may be certain cases that's true. Right, maybe you're a little bit on the autism spectrum, or maybe there's some dark triad stuff going on, or maybe there's some trauma that prevents you from happening. But I would say that's not always the case, and probably not even the majority of cases in which that's true. I think there's just some people who are like less in touch with their emotions, and they do care deeply about other people, but it's not going to be that like, oh my god, like blushing, effusive kind of love. And I don't think it needs to be. I think, look, you need to have a baseline level of physical attraction to this person. I do think that is important. Like, you need to have some physical intimacy and enjoy sex together. Like, that actually does predict relationship satisfaction long term. You have to be on the same page in terms of your libido and the frequency in which you want to have physical intimacy. That's also really important. And if your libido is way higher than hers and that's not negotiated, that's also going to be problematic. So I actually think that physical intimacy is very, very important, which is a different sort of thing than the googly feelings of love. It's the feelings of, obviously, sexual desire, intimacy, and pleasure. That is very important. And then make sure that you're on the same page about that. And she's providing you with satisfaction, whether it's visually or physically. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's literally what we're hardwired to do. And as superficial as it sounds, it matters in a relationship. It's not the only thing that matters, or it's not the most important thing that matters. But look, some chemistry needs to be there, and then that's not an unpopular opinion. You can ask any men or women; they generally agree with that. So make sure that you're on the same page in terms of physical attraction and physical intimacy. That's first and foremost. Second, I do think it's useful to almost borrow an analogy from sort of happiness, in that the pursuit of pleasure, as I talked about in previous shows, is a shitty way to live your life, right? That's hedonism versus what the Greeks called eudaimonia, or the pursuit of satisfaction or contentment. The difference is that's a cognitive appraisal, it's not a feeling. Chasing feelings is a terrible way to live your life because nobody can be happy all the time, just as nobody can be head over heels in love all the time. We know that even if you were head over heels at the beginning of your relationship, you're having an amazing time on your honeymoon. Is that going to last 5, 10 years later? For some people, yes. God bless those people because they're lucky individuals. For a lot of people, quite frankly, it fades, or at least it diminishes significantly. Because yeah, kids, you got drama, you're getting old. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on, and you're not going to be like ecstatic all the time. So I would get rid of that expectation. But just like it's important to find meaning in life, to find satisfaction in life, to find contentment in life, I do think you need to be deeply content in your relationship. So it's fine if you don't get butterflies in your stomach, but ask yourself this: when you look at your partner, right, you think about your partner, do you have a deep respect and admiration for your partner? When you think, man, I really like this person, I admire this person, what they stand for, I believe in their values. I think they treat me really well. It's someone that I want to treat really well, and I want to serve, and I want to give, and I want to invest in this person because they're worth it and our relationship is worth it, right? That's an intellectual, that's an appraisal thing. It's not an emotional thing. Now, as you do this, as if you sit there and you think about your partner and you're like, you know what? She's a remarkable human being. I'm a lucky guy to be with her because she likes a motherfucker like me, and I with all my issues and weaknesses and whatever. And don't get me wrong, you should have high self esteem. But if you're like, man, I feel lucky to be with this person, I respect and admire her so deeply, and she treats me well, and she's a good human being, and she's aligned with my values, then you're a lucky guy, and I think that's enough, right? So you love, you're not, maybe it's not this feeling of being in love, but you do love her, right? And that love may be felt uh to you in a much more intellectual way than it does in a emotional way. But as I was saying, as you're kind of talking about this, even if it's going through your head or you're reflecting about it or you're hearing me say it, it may bring up some feelings too. It may not be like I said, oh my God, like your cheeks are turning red, you're getting flushed kind of love. But it should stir you in some way, right? It should bring up some emotion in you where, like I said, even if you're thinking about deep, profound respect and admiration, if you're feeling that way about your partner, it should bring up something. Like I said, assuming that you don't have sort of some emotional deficit, empathic deficit that comes from some underlying issue, it should move you, but it's not going to necessarily feel like butterflies in your stomach where, oh my God, it's like, you're Prince Charming and she's Snow White. I think you got to get rid of that Hollywood romance. But you look upon her and you feel good. You feel at peace. You feel content. You feel lucky. You feel charmed. Those are the kinds of feelings that may not be that great googly kind of feelings of in love, but it does stir you a little bit, like kind of deeper in your gut. And I think that, to me, is love. And guys are much more capable, I would argue, of feeling that than the great Hollywood romance kind of bubbly kind of love. So that's my advice, is if you're kind of thinking about that, lower the expectations, get out of the Hollywood Disney fantasy of what love you think should be and how you should feel. Because maybe you're not either wired to feel that way, maybe she's not the one, or maybe your expectations are just anomalous. But if you're using the gauge that I suggest instead, which is this cognitive appraisal, and you have this deep respect, admiration, and love for this person, and maybe it'll stir up some a little bit deeper, maybe a little bit more mellow kind of feelings, then don't discount that. Maybe you are in love, but that's just not, it just doesn't meet your expectations of what love is. So I think that's very important too. And then one last final bit of advice is, if you go through that exercise that I just said, right? And you still can't decide whether you're in love with her or not, like even on a cognitive level, then you're probably not, right? Look, in the end, relationships are hard. The divorce rate's like 50, 60% at this point. Um, and if you're really not sure, you're really ambivalent, and you've spent enough time with this person that you should know, then they're probably not the one, right? I think because relationships are so hard, marriage have such high failure rates, you should have a relatively strong degree of confidence about whether you care deeply for this person and you're willing to, quite frankly, make some significant personal risk and sacrifice, and give up a lot for this person. You don't need to be 100% convinced. Nobody is. Like, I think cold feet on the day of your wedding is quite normal, but better be more than 50%. I'll tell you that, just because of how difficult it is. And marriage is, quite frankly, biased against men, at least if you're talking about marriage in common law states, in American society. It is not legally and financially in your best interest, quite frankly, to get married. Now, we still do it anyway for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's for romance, maybe it's for love, maybe it's for cultural and family expectations. But it's not a great deal for men. And so if you're going to do it, you should feel confident about this person. I'm not telling you not to get married. It is a great thing, and it is a great sacrifice, but make sure that they're worth it. And yeah, as I've talked about in my article, in terms of decision making, if you're not sure, then the answer is no. So that's a useful rule of thumb, because maybe your ambivalence is really telling you something. If it's not telling you yes, then it's telling you there's something wrong, and you can't sort of pinpoint it. So hopefully that answers your three questions. Great three-part question. Please feel free to follow up, whether it's here in the Discord, or I think you originally DM me on Twitter. I would love to hear if you actually start to have conversations with your girlfriend about, this whole people don't change thing. How did that go? More importantly, if you have the discussion about affection, which I much more strongly recommend, I'd love to hear how that goes. And I'd love to hear if you figure out whether you love her or not. maybe applying this framework a little bit will give you a better guide to doing so. All right. Let's get to the second question. Before I do, is there anyone who wants to chime in and ask a question? All right. If not, I will get to question number two. Question number two. Hi, Cam. I read your thread on sleep a while back and have been averaging 8.5 hours a night since December. Been a game changer. Thank you. Well, first of all, amazing. Thank you. I love it when I get these responses from people on Twitter, like reading some old thread that I wrote. Sometimes you just put things out into like the universe and you never think anyone reads these things. And then I'm like so pleasantly surprised when I get like these messages saying like, I read this a year ago or since December and it's changed my life. So first of all, congratulations to you. You get all the credit for this. I can give you, great science and great, guidance, but it's all meaningless unless you put it into practice. And the fact that you're doing that and getting 8.5 hours, which is great, by the way, if for folks who are listening, the recommendation is 7 to 9 hours. That's the sort of the best that we know from science. People always think if you sleep more than 8 hours, there's something wrong with you. And this is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the literature on sleep. There is an association of negative health outcomes when people are sleeping 9, 10 hours a night. The problem with that is that's a phenomenon called hypersomnia. Hypersomnia is sleeping too much or excessively, but that often comes as a result of either depression or disease. So it's confounded, right? There are healthy people who sleep 9 hours a night. They're often like people who work out a lot, physically active athletes, and they need that much sleep to recover. Then there's people who are actually like sick, whether psychologically or physically. And then you lump in all that data and you say, oh, how are these people in terms of their health? It's going to be a mixed bag, obviously, and they're going to be worse off than the person sleeping 8 hours a night just kind of normally. So some people have made a very foolhardy conclusion from that and said, oh, it's bad to oversleep. I disagree. If you have no medical or psychiatric issues and you need to sleep 8.5 hours, 9.5 hours a night, then that's what your body needs. So listen to your body. My rule of thumb, by the way, is you never should need to wake up with an alarm clock, because by definition, if you're waking up with an alarm clock, you are sleep deprived because your body obviously wanted to sleep more and you didn't let it. So you should hopefully get to a point where you can sleep enough. Now, the caveat to that is if you're not sleeping enough, there's a lot of people who get 5, 6 hours of sleep every night, and then their body will wake themselves up, not because they've gotten enough sleep, but just because of the habit. If you're used to waking up at like whatever it is, 5 a.m., and you go to sleep at midnight every night, it doesn't mean you need 5 hours of sleep. It just means that you've conditioned your circadian rhythm to wake up at 5 a.m., have a cortisol release, and it forces you to be up. That unfortunately takes a little bit of retraining to get that out of you. So the lesson from that is undersleeping does not mean that you've gotten enough sleep. If you're oversleeping, it may not be problematic, like I said, as long as you don't have any medical or psychiatric conditions. So if you need 8.5 hours, then you're totally fine. Now let's get to his question. He said, next goal is to get under a 25 BMI and 15% body fat, currently closer to 30 BMI. Been running, doing cardio, but want to start lifting. Do you have any resources on the best way to start training? Want to get in Giga Chad's shape and maximize testosterone levels and performance? Would really appreciate your advice. Thank you. Well, first of all, great question. I love the goal. There's an original Twitter thread that I said, you should try to get into a healthy BMI. Now, the reason I say that, by the way, BMI is obviously not the best metric. There's a lot of very athletic guys who, they may have an elevated BMI because they're so muscular. I'm actually a good example. I think my BMI is pretty close to 25, even though I'm nowhere near overweight and probably at like 10%, 12% body fat. But I'm not like a normal sort of guy, right? So I would argue 15% body fat is a better metric than a BMI under 25 if you're in shape. And here's the thing, I always tell people, like, you don't really need to do a DEXA scan. Sure, if you really want to, or it's easily available or cheap, by all means, go do it. The biometric assessments on weight scales in terms of body fat percentage are terribly off, especially if you're athletic. So don't believe the numbers on the body fat scales. I think mine says I'm like 22% when I'm clearly like I said, 10 or 12. It just doesn't handle athletic people very well. The best rule of thumb is what I call the mirror test, which is just look at yourself in the mirror and look at your stomach. If you have a six pack, a clearly defined six pack, you're probably in that 8, 10, 12% range. If you have like a loosely defined abs, you can see like, I don't know, two or four of them, you're probably between the 12 and 15% range. And if you can't see anything, maybe you see like a line kind of down the middle, but not distinct abs in terms of the rows, maybe you're around like 15%, and there's no sort of lines or cuts or definition in terms of your abdominals or your obliques, which are the side sort of muscles to the left and right of the abs, then you're probably over 15%. 15 to 20%, though, you can still look pretty good. You're just not going to look defined. You just look like an average kind of guy who's in shape. But once you're going past 20% body fat, you definitely got a little bit extra around the belly, right? That's what we call central adiposity. And you should obviously try to reduce that as much as possible because we know you asked a question about how to maximize testosterone levels and performance. So here's my advice to you. We've had a whole conversation about doing this, but the number one thing that you in particular can do to maximize your testosterone levels is to lose the central adiposity, lose the excess belly fat. Why is that? It's because when you carry around extra body fat, that body fat has an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase converts testosterone to estrogen, especially estradiol, the primary sort of estrogen. And so, if you think about a healthy balance between testosterone and estradiol, in a man, they have high testosterone, low estrogen or estradiol. It's the flip flop opposite in women, right? The thing is, though, the more belly fat that you have, the more aromatase is going to essentially convert testosterone to estradiol and shift the balance of the two. So your testosterone goes down, your estrogen or estradiol goes up, right? And that's obviously not in your favor. You want a good T to E ratio, testosterone to estradiol ratio. And generally speaking, I would suggest like a healthy ratio, like total testosterone being 500, an estradiol level of 20. So you want like a 25 to 1 would be like an optimal or higher, greater than 25 to 1. If you're talking about free testosterone to estradiol, about like 100 to 20 would be sort of like an average level. So about a 5 to 1 ratio would be good. So 25 to 1 if you're talking about total testosterone to estradiol, about 5 to 1 if you're talking about free testosterone to estradiol. These are just rules of thumb. But if you ever get them measured, it's kind of a useful thing. I would bet if your BMI is closer to 30, which by the way is in the obese range, you're not going to be at those levels. Your testosterone is probably artificially suppressed by the excess body fat and the aromatization that's happening peripherally, meaning around your body, around your gut, and your estradiol is probably going to be artificially inflated. So the best thing you can do is to lose it. So, I mean, needless to say, you probably already know that because you don't want to be obese. You know it's bad for your health, but now you know why it's specifically bad for your hormones, and you understand the physiology, hopefully, by kind of giving you that explanation. Now, here's the concern that I have about your question, though. Your question is, you're like, I need to get from a 30 BMI to 25, or I want to get at least under 15% body fat because it's gonna, like I said, improve my hormone levels, maximize my testosterone, lower my estrogen. But your approach is I've been doing running cardio. I want to start lifting. That is not the best way to lose weight. And I think I hope that's not your primary thing. Now, the research literature by far shows, and I spent a lot of time in my career doing weight loss stuff. In fact, my first company's helped 500,000 people lose 5 million pounds. I've published multiple papers on it. The number one factor in terms of reducing your body fat and reducing weight is nutrition. It's not exercise. Exercise, and there's been a ton of research on this, does very little for weight loss. It's not that it's not important. I'll talk about why it's important. But if your goal is primarily to lose weight and lose body fat, you lose it in the kitchen. I say the same thing, by the way, we were talking about abs. Abs are made in the kitchen. They're not made by doing crunches. You cannot spot treat your abs. So what I would say is, what's your diet? You didn't talk about your diet. That's the best thing that you can do to make sure that you're getting that down. And I would suggest for you is number one is you should understand what you're eating. I don't think people need to track every single food or their calorie, but I do think it's useful to do that temporarily. And so if you're willing to do that, like for instance, track your food on Chronometer. If you're willing, track it for I would say 2 to 3 days. Give me at least 1 or 2 weekdays and do 1 or 2 weekends because people's eating behavior changes dramatically on Saturdays, Sundays, Friday, Saturday, Sundays. They'll overeat in terms of their calories. Uh, but give me like a representative like weekday, weekend, and I will look at it and I'll give you feedback in terms of what you're eating. So if you want to submit that to me, whether on Discord, Twitter, etc., I will give you, some pointers. I'm not going to give you medical advice, but I'll be curious to see what you're eating. And then what you want to do is number two is you want to weigh in on your scale every single day. This is something that we did at Omada, and there's a ton of research literature that shows that daily weighing improves weight loss even more than weekly weighing. And why is that? Because daily it actually goes up and down, right? It may be due to water weight, fluid retention because of how much salt that you had, all kinds of factors. Maybe you just had an off day, you ate more, or you forgot to eat lunch, and it's not that you're actually losing weight. The reason is psychological accountability. When you step on the scale every day, you remind yourself, I'm trying to lose weight. I'm trying to get from a BMI of 30 to 25, and I'm on this mission. And so, but when you do it once a week, you forget, and you can go off course for like 6 days before you remind yourself, oh man, I forgot about what I was doing in terms of my weight loss journey. But when you weigh in every day, you remind yourself. And also, if you get off track, you can correct course faster, right? Like if you did gain 1, maybe 2 pounds over the course of 2, 3 days, you're like, oh, I'm trending in the wrong direction. Let me adjust course. Versus if you don't weigh in for a week, you can put on like 5 pounds very easily before you realize what's happening. So, step number two, besides doing a temporary sort of food tracking, is I do recommend stepping on a scale every single day. And man, I can't tell you how important this is. We had participants that would travel and they would literally bring their scale, they'd pack it in their luggage in their suitcase because they didn't want to miss a day and break their streak. So I think that's very, very instrumental. And then third, I would suggest that you find an eating plan that you're willing to do and able to sustain long term. That's what I say always is the best diet is the one that you're willing to do and able to sustain long term. I don't care what people say is the superior diet because look, I could talk about all the benefits of ketogenic diets, how low carb diets are superior for weight loss over low fat diets, how there probably should be the first line treatment for diabetes, which I and a consensus panel of scientists believe. But if you're not willing to do it and give up all the carbs, then it's pointless. Then it's just theory, right? And you don't need to, by the way, only eat a low carb ketogenic diet to lose weight. It's probably the best diet for weight loss. Uh, but calories, even though they're imperfect, it's not the only thing that matters. It does matter to some degree. And there's people who lose weight just eating Twinkies. They've proven that, right? It's obviously not recommended, but reducing your caloric intake will help you lose weight. So on that note, I think that matters a lot. Find a diet that works for you. I generally think, but I have sort of like universal principles of diets that's regardless of whatever diet. And here are my 3 recommendations for healthy eating. I actually retweeted this today. So number 1, eat at home as much as you can and prepare your own food. By far, the biggest predictor of food quality and nutritional quality is whether you're preparing your food because you can control what goes in it versus you're eating out at a restaurant. And I guarantee you, having been behind the scenes at many restaurants, the quality of the food at most restaurants is very poor. And second, it's not optimized for nutrition. Almost all restaurants use cheap, refined seed oils, which include canola oil, soybean oil, peanut oil, rice bran oil, etc., that did not exist prior to 50 years ago. They use chemicals like hexane in order to extract them. And they're volatile in that when you cook them at high temperatures, they change to other chemicals, which can often be toxic. So unless you specifically ask them to cook it in butter, ghee, or olive oil, they're probably using a cheap refined seed oil, and you have no control over that. And that's very pro-inflammatory, and it's going to make it hard for you to lose weight. So number 1, I actually think the best predictor, by the way, of like people who lose weight and keep it off is you just got to cook for yourself. You got to prepare food at home. And there's quite frankly no excuse about it. You can learn. You don't need to make fancy recipes. I always say most cooking is overrated because for some weird reason we think that like using a cookbook and following recipes is cooking. And when people say I don't know how to cook, I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. Throw some meat Chop up some meat, throw it in a pan, like literally buy hamburger patties, throw it in a pan and heat it till it's no longer red. That's cooking, right? Anyone who's like semi competent can cook. All you do have is to chop up things and heat it in a pan. It doesn't need to be fancy. Add some oil, add some salt, add some pepper, season to taste. It's not complicated, folks. You can literally, there's oftentimes when I'm in a hurry and I can cook a meal, eat it, and do the dishes in 10 minutes if I need to, right? Obviously, I usually try to take a little bit more time and savor my food, but 10, 15 minutes, you can literally start to finish, including cleanup time, have a healthy dinner. So there's no reason. I guarantee you, just like going out to a restaurant is going to take more time than that. And unfortunately, the ubiquitousness of Uber Eats and all these DoorDash delivery things, the quality of the food has actually gone down even more. So rule number one, make your own food. Rule number two, uh, minimize the use of food that has nutritional labels. By definition, if it has a nutritional label, it's not a whole food. Think about what whole foods are. It's the stuff at the periphery of the grocery store. It's not the stuff in the middle. Anything that's in an aisle is basically junk. It's usually like ultra processed food. But if you're talking about meat, fruit, and vegetables, they don't have a nutrition label because what's in an avocado? An avocado doesn't need a label. What's in a sirloin steak? It says sirloin steak. It doesn't have a nutrition label. So nutrition label comes from processed foods. So you want to basically minimize the amount of foods that have any label because it's a one ingredient thing and you know exactly what you're eating. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't eat anything with a nutrition label, but the backup to that is what are called minimally processed foods. What's a minimally processed food versus an ultra processed food? Minimally processed foods generally have no more than I would say 2 to 5 ingredients. They should be stuff that easy to pronounce. You understand what it is. A good example is yogurt. Yogurt is a processed food. It doesn't come out of the cow like that. It's milk, but the only ingredients in yogurt are cow milk and like active cultures or bacteria, right? So when you look at the label, it's 2 ingredients. It's like milk and bacteria, milk or cultures. So it's a minimally processed food. Another useful rule of thumb to understand whether something's minimally processed is can you make it at home, theoretically, right? You can make yogurt at home. I've made kefir at home. Yeah, it is follow a recipe. But like, let's compare that to a Cheeto. There's no way you can make a Cheeto at home. Like, it's made in a factory. It uses complex machinery or whatever it is, but it's not an easy thing to make at home. So if you couldn't make it like butter or milk or cheese, those are examples of traditional foods that have been made thousands of years without factories or technology. Minimally processed foods are okay to have as a supplement or complement to whole foods. So number one, cook your own food. Number two, um, avoid things with nutritional labels. And number three, eat mostly animals. I know this is contrary to the primary advice of people like Michael Pollan, who are, by the way, journalists. They're not clinicians or scientists. So, quite frankly, why are you listening to a journalist about science? No disrespect to Michael Pollan, but he's wrong. And his advice in Omnivore's Dilemma was, eat food, not a lot, mostly plants. That has to be the worst nutrition advice, by the way, I've ever heard. Except for the first one, which is eat food, which is I agree with. It's eat real food. That's the only one of the 3 rules that I agree with. Not a lot is terrible advice because we know that starvation diets do not work. If you starve yourself, sure, you can lose weight temporarily, but you're going to get hungry. You're going to gain all the weight back, which happens to 95% of people. So I actually give the opposite advice. You should eat to satiety. You should be full. Now, it shouldn't be bursting at the seams full, but you should be satisfied. And if you're not going to be satisfied, you're not going to be able to maintain that diet long term. So you should eat to satiety, not like trying to not eat a lot. That's a terrible approach. And he said mostly plants, which is completely wrong because if you look at the anthropological literature on hunter gatherers, right, we don't know that much about nutrition. There's a lot of debate, just like I'm talking about my versus Michael Pollan's view. So my argument is look at traditional diets because at least the way that we've been eating for thousands of years traditionally prior to the industrialization of food and the advent of big food probably is directionally correct. And those, if you look at hunter gatherers, even though there is some variability in terms of how close they are to the equator, obviously people who live at very high latitudes like the Inuits or what are called Eskimos, there's not a lot of plants, so they eat more meat versus plants. But still, even if you look at places where there's tons of fruit and tons of plants, the majority of the calories come from animals. And so we are primarily meat eaters. Vegetarian, vegan diets do not make any sense. They are not ancestral. They're not Lindy, as Taleb would call them, and they're not optimal for health. And there's tons of studies that show that, including studies that show brain shrinkage, reduces in sperm count, sperm quality. Literally makes you less fertile, which means it's less reproductively viable, which means it's a terrible diet. It's for your health. Any diet that lowers your testosterone or your ability to conceive is by definition a poor and inferior diet. So you should primarily eat animals. Now the thing is, you want to make sure that it's good quality animals. If you can afford grass-fed, wild-caught beef, fish, etc., great. If not, it's still better to eat, I would argue, conventional beef and fish than it is eating a bunch of plant-based stuff or processed junk. So do what's practical and reasonable for your budget and the availability of your food. But I'll give you an example. If an analysis of Northern American, Native American diets show that 85% of their calories came from animal-based foods and 15% came from plant-based foods. I would say somewhere on the order of 50 to 85% is what you should shoot for in terms of animal-based, and the other 15 to 50% you should get from plant-based foods. Now, you can figure out what that right balance is for you, for your goals, your macros, and your food preferences. But you should eat mostly animals. So to recap, my dietary recommendations is the best diet is the one that you could stick to long term, and it should be food that you're preparing mostly yourself, food that mostly does not have a nutritional label or has a minimal number of ingredients, and finally, it should be mostly animal based because it is the quite frankly superior diet for health and performance optimization. All right. We got some questions from YouTube. Can you point me in the direction of resources to naturally boost testosterone? Is there anything that you recommend? That's one of the big things that we do at Maximus Tribe. So I would suggest just get on our email list. You can go to maximustribe.com. We're actually working on an ebook that talks about health behaviors that you can do to maximize your natural or baseline levels. The thing is, though, you can get up to whatever your genetic set point or potential is, but if you really want to optimize, that's where medicine and other optimization techniques are going to kick in. So I do think it's important to do all the health behavior stuff to get you to your natural set point. If you want to be a better than average or beyond your potential, then we can talk about solutions, and the best way to do that is to join our email list. Because there's a bunch of books out there. Someone mentioned like a Tucker Max book about how to naturally increase your testosterone. I think it's a misleading thing. It's not going to increase your testosterone at all. It might get you to where you should have been, or at least could be. But like I said, it's not going to move the needle that much. I'll give you an example. Sleep is obviously very important for general health, and even testosterone. But the literature shows, for instance, that the difference between people who sleep 5 hours a night and the people who sleep 9 hours a night, it's a pretty drastic difference, right? You're talking about 4 hours a night. You're not going to feel good on 5 hours a night. You're going to feel tired. You're going to feel sleep deprived, may affect your libido. It's probably actually going to have a bigger effect on your symptoms and your functioning than it is your testosterone. A lot of people, if you're sleeping for 9 hours a night, you're probably going to feel much, much better. You're going to perform much, much better. But the difference in testosterone levels was like, I believe 10 to 15%, which is not very meaningful clinically. So you should absolutely do it. 10 to 15%. Now, if you add that to like the 10 to 15% you get from a better diet, the 10 to 15% that you get from improving your focus and not wasting time in front of the computer all the time, the 10 to 15% that you get from managing your stress, that may totally add up to like 50%. And at that point, 50% may be a meaningful difference, much more than 10%. So I'm not saying it's worthless to use, for instance, sleep as an enhancement of testosterone. It does work, but it's part of a whole package of health behaviors, and it's just one of many things that you need to do. So it's not going to, like I said, significantly increase your testosterone to do these health behaviors. The cumulative effect of all of them will get you to like I said, your natural biological set point to some degree. Although the sad part is, I argue that none of us are at our biological set points because we're in this terribly polluted environment with all these endocrine disrupting chemicals, BPAs, phthalates, PFASs. And so that's why our testosterone levels are half of what our fathers were. And that's why I actually do think that, like, you got to fight fire with fire. If chemicals are causing it, Well, you can use, those are bad chemicals. You can use good chemicals, whether it's medications or supplement, to counteract the effects of those endocrine disrupting chemicals. So, in my opinion, it's not cheating. It's actually getting you back to where you should have been, or at least where your dad or your grandfather was, because they didn't live in such a terribly polluted environment where they're touching all these receipts with BPA, which literally absorb into your bloodstream immediately. So, don't touch receipts, guys. I know it sounds like a crazy thing, but there's in fact published scientific research that shows that touching of receipts it gets BPA into your bloodstream. And ironically, we sanitize our hands with alcohol all the time to keep them clean. It increases the absorption of those chemicals into your hands. So it's not to say don't use alcohol or don't wash your hands. Do so, but just be careful what you're touching, because things that are like that, they do absorb into our bloodstream, and it does affect it. And you can literally measure the amount of BPA when people touch receipts. So that's a small tip, but it does show that these little things matter. Um, so, like I said, if you get on our email list, we'll have our health behavior guide in terms of getting you to where you should be in terms of testosterone, and it has some tips about how to go above and beyond. Using sort of the latest and cutting edge science and medicine, which I'm very excited to talk about in some future shows. All right. Thank you, everyone. It is 7 o'clock. We had some great questions today on the Maximus call in radio show. We had a question about a three-part question about relationships, about kind of how do you have a discussion about change? How do you have a discussion about not getting enough affection? And how do you know whether you're in love? So that was a very fun series of questions to answer. Had a great question about the best weight of losing weight to go from a BMI of 30 to 25. And talked a little bit about sort of testosterone optimization at the end as well. So thank you, everyone. We'll be able to post this after the show, and I'll put some resources in the Discord channel if you want to continue the conversation in the chat. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.